This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. The Lost Episode. Yes, you heard us right. This is our Lost Episode. Actually, this is our first Lost Episode. And we know what you're thinking. How did we lose an episode? And how do we know we're going to lose more episodes in the future? Don't worry, we're going to explain. We always do. To understand where the lost episodes came from, you need to understand how each episode gets written. And it's worth taking a few minutes to describe, because many correspondents have asked us about our process. And a few others have unkindly criticized our research when our findings didn't jive with whatever they thought was true. To the untrained eye, the process of writing Word of the Week might seem like a simple endeavor. It's basically a mashup of role-playing games and what is commonly called the Wikipedia effect. You know how when you look up something on Wikipedia, you invariably come across a link in the article that piques your interest? So you click the link and find yourself reading another half an article, and then another link brings you somewhere else, and another, until somehow, even though you started by looking up the Everglades National Park, you're somehow reading about the career of Martin Mull? Well, that's probably how you picture the Word of the Week happening. But the truth is a much bigger pain in the hindquarters. First of all, we have some strict rules when it comes to our research. One of them is never stop at Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not a source of anything more than basic ideas. We always have to find our way back to more reliable, credible sources. And that is how we ended up reading a 10-page academic thesis on the role of the ash tree in Germanic mythology, which is not nearly as exciting as it sounds. Another rule is that we have to find at least one thing to tell you that you wouldn't be able to easily turn up by clicking links on the first page of a Google search. And frankly, it's those rules that make us hate the writing process for this show. The real problem, though, is that we're not really trying to emulate the Wikipedia problem. Instead, we, by which I mean both me, Fiddleback, who edits, records, and produces the show, and the angry GM who researches and writes the scripts, we are both fans of a British historian named James Burke. Because we're both, technically speaking, old, we remember James Burke from a PBS television series based on his first book, Connections. In it, James Burke would take a sort of meandering garden path journey through history, anthropology, and sociology to show how disparate and unrelated ideas and events were connected. If you like the Word of the Week, you'll probably like Connections. But don't check it out, because James Burke does it way better than we do, even though his British accent doesn't compare to the smooth NPR basso profundo that I, Fiddleback, bring to the show. It's embarrassing how good Connections 1, 2, and 3 are. The point is, the real key to each episode is that there has to be some connection between everything we discuss. The best episodes, in our opinion, are the ones that manage to loop back in on themselves and end where they started, or that show a parallel between seemingly unrelated things. And pulling that off means we often find a lot more information for each episode than we really need. Between trying to tie everything into a neat little package and trying to keep ourselves to what we consider to be a comfortable bite-sized running time, that means a lot of interesting bits and pieces end up getting cut from the final project. And that is extremely painful because it means we leave a lot of really fascinating stuff on the table. But it's also painful because that research takes a lot of time that is ultimately wasted. And at least 50% of us get angry about that. So, we hit on the idea of keeping a list of the most interesting tidbits that didn't make the cut and compiling them into a sort of lost episode. And that's what you're listening to right now. So let's get to it. The longest bit that ended up on the editing room floor had to be cut because it nearly consumed the entire episode about the river Styx. If you carefully listened to that episode, you might have noticed that among the many qualities we ascribed to the Styx, one of them was never explained. And that was that the Styx made you immortal. That was a reference to the story of the Greek hero Achilles. Idiomatically, his name is the origin of the phrase Achilles' heel, meaning a fatal weakness. Anatomically, his name is the origin of the name of the thickest tendon in the human body. A tendon is, of course, a bit of fibrous tissue that anchors muscle to bone. And you can find your Achilles tendon at the back of your ankle. That thick cord-like thing under your skin between your ankle and your heel that is super easy to injure, tear, or rupture. That's it. But to understand why Achilles had an easily injured leg tendon and a fatal weakness named after him, you have to understand how paranoid his mother was. First of all, it should be noted that Achilles was probably a mythical figure, but there does exist the possibility that he was a real person. The thing is, Achilles played a big part in the Trojan War, the war between the Greek states and the nation of Troy. And we're not entirely sure whether that war was real, or even if Troy was a real place. Most of what we know about it comes from the writer Homer's great epic, the Iliad, and so much fiction and mythology is mixed into that book that it's hard to be sure if any of it is real. According to Homer, for example, the Trojan War was started by Zeus as a population reduction scheme. Zeus set up a fake beauty pageant between three vain goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus set the Prince of Troy, Paris, to judge the contest. Each of the goddesses tried to bribe Paris, and ultimately he took Aphrodite's offer. The most beautiful woman in the world would be his wife. Unfortunately, the literal trophy wife, Helen, was married to King Menelaus of Sparta. But that didn't stop Paris from heading over there, claiming his prize, and taking her back to Troy. And thus, by that simple plan, Zeus started the Trojan War. Achilles was the son of Peleus, ruler of the Myrmidons, who were exceptional warriors. His mother, Thetis, was a Nereid, a river spirit. That sort of mixed-up species relationship was not uncommon in Greek stories. At least Thetis was mostly humanoid, because bulls, horses, and clouds of golden mist were also known to have kids with people. Thetis was terrified that Achilles would grow into a soldier and get himself killed, so she doused him in the river Styx in order to confer upon him the blessing of immortality. Because that was a thing the Styx could do, apparently. The problem was, she held him by the ankle, and so the water never touched his heel. She never realized that, though, and figured the kid was invulnerable. But then, a prophet warned her that Achilles was fated to die in battle. Thetis got even more paranoid and dressed him like a girl and sent him to live on the island of Skyros. But Achilles didn't dig the cross-dressing island life and fled to join the army. In desperation, Thetis went to the smith god Hephaestus and begged him to make her kid weapons and armor that would protect him in battle. They didn't make him all-powerful, though. All they did was make him recognizable as the biggest, baddest hero on the battlefield. Essentially, that made him a target. Now, none of this is in the Iliad. In the Iliad, Achilles was just a strong, skilled hero who confronted Troy's hero Hector and killed him. He then left the battle when he was forced by his commander to relinquish his wife to the commander to replace a concubine he'd been forced to set free by the god Apollo. It all got very complicated. The end result was that Achilles' friend, Patroclus, dressed up in Achilles' armor to make everyone think Achilles was still in the fight. After the war was over, though, Apollo, who was still angry about the whole Trojan War thing, the concubine, and a lot of other stuff that happened, decided to exact revenge on Achilles. Apollo told Paris that Achilles was coming to kill him in revenge for the whole Trojan War thing, and Paris ambushed Achilles. Paris fired an arrow from his bow, and Apollo, god of archery, among many other things, guided the arrow to Achilles' heel, the one spot where he wasn't invulnerable. And he died. The end. But not everything we cut out is just too long to fit in an episode. Sometimes we have to leave shorter bits sitting on the floor because they just don't fit the theme of the episode, even if they are interesting. For example, in our episode about the city of Brass, we discussed the inner planes of matter and energy, and we almost made an offhand remark about how the two, matter and energy, are actually the same thing. And that is something physicist Albert Einstein described in his most famous equation that is totally not the theory of relativity. But it did grow out of it. And it appeared during something called the Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year. And even though it was going to be a short mention, we have some breathing room here, so we can talk about what made that year, 1905, so miraculous. If you ask most people to quote the theory of relativity, they'll say it's E = mc squared. And they will be wrong. And they probably won't understand what it actually means anyway. But the meaning is really simple. What you have to understand is that there are two basic types of stuff in the universe. First, there's matter. Matter is things, physical stuff. It has weight, or rather mass. And then there is energy. Energy isn't really a thing, but it allows things to happen. Objects in motion have energy which keeps them moving. Heat is a type of energy. If you hold something above the ground, it has energy because it wants to fall. And when you let it go, that potential energy turns into the energy of motion. But what Einstein discovered is that, on a fundamental level, matter and energy are the same thing. You can convert energy to matter and vice versa. And the equation, E = mc squared, is called the mass-energy equivalence because it tells you the conversion. Multiply the amount of mass you have by the speed of light, the c, or constant, multiplied by itself, and that will tell you how much energy you can turn that mass into. Now, the speed of light is very, very large. It's 186,000 miles per second. And squared, that's 34,596,000,000. Scientifically speaking, that's what we call a big number. So, if you were to convert the roughly 450 pounds of the Word of the Week team into pure energy, you would get about 5 billion megawatt hours. That would power all of New York City for roughly 50 years. Put another way, that is about 300 times the energy unleashed by the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. But it turns out it's almost impossible to convert matter to energy, at least on the large scale. On the very, very small scale, nuclear reactors convert tiny, tiny fractions of matter into energy every day. So even though there is enough energy locked up in every human being to wipe 150 cities off the face of the earth, you can't actually do much with that. But, as we noted, that's not the theory of relativity. But it did grow out of the theory of relativity. See, in the early 1900s, physics was kind of a mess, and one of the big arguments was whether light, and its cousins heat, X-rays, and other forms of radiation, was made of electromagnetic waves, or whether it was made of particles of light. Einstein figured out a way to answer this question by looking at something called the photoelectric effect. Basically, if you shine light on a piece of metal, electricity comes out. And he realized that photons, particles of light, were basically knocking electrons out of the metal and producing the electricity. Shortly thereafter, he realized the same thing could explain a weird phenomenon called Brownian motion. That's the random motion of tiny particles like dust caught in a sunbeam. So in March of 1905, he wrote his first paper about the photoelectric effect. Shortly thereafter, in May, he wrote about Brownian motion. And he revolutionized the way physicists thought about radiation. But he wasn't done, because he discovered a new problem. Basically, he figured that the laws of physics should always be the same, Wherever you are in the universe and however you are moving, the laws of physics shouldn't change. And that means that you should never be able to tell if you're moving or if you're standing still and the universe is moving around you. When you're stopped at a traffic light and you take your foot off the brakes, for example, in those first few moments, you can't tell if your car is moving forward or the car next to you is moving backward. That's relativity. And that makes sense, right? But he had a problem. When you have something with an electrical charge and it moves around, it creates electromagnetic waves. For example, if you pump electricity through a coiled wire, you can make an electromagnet. So if you carry something with an electric charge, you can tell if you're moving or not based on whether magnetism happens. And Einstein figured some really complex, crazy stuff out. First of all, he discovered that light behaves kind of weird. It always moves at the same speed no matter who is looking at it and from what direction they are looking. Because electromagnetism is the same thing as light, that means, based on some rather complicated math, that you can't tell if you're moving just by watching electrical charges and electromagnetic waves. Second, he realized that the universe is bent and curved in some crazy ways. That space and time can bend and change depending on how you move in them. The end result being any two people, no matter where they are or how they measure, will always agree on the speed of light. That's why it's the constant. And that's true even if time has to slow down, or weights have to change, or distances have to get warped. And all of that is wrapped up in the two theories of relativity, the special one, which applies to things sitting still, and the general one, which applies to things that are moving around or under the influence of gravity. And that's the paper he wrote in July of the very same year, 1905. When he did some more maths, he discovered the mass-energy equivalence, and he wrote that paper in November of 1905. Thus, in 1905, Albert Einstein wrote 4 papers that revolutionized everything physicists knew about the universe, light, matter, energy, and the laws of physics. And that is why it is called his Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year. And if you're wondering why we still call light an electromagnetic wave, even though Einstein proved it was a particle, well, it turns out he was only half right. The revolution that Einstein helped start, quantum physics, eventually proved that light behaves as both a wave and a particle depending on the situation. But Einstein also never fully accepted that craziness. Let's end with something a little lighter. In our episode on thieves' tools, we discovered something that we didn't know about medieval doors. And that led us to take issue with one of the most common plans players resort to once picking the lock has failed and the door stands fast against attempts to break it down. And so, Game Masters, we can say resolutely that you are entirely within your rights to say, no, sorry, you can't take that door off its hinges. And that's because doors didn't have hinges back then. In case you're not aware, a hinge consists of 2 interlocked metal anchors with a pin running between them. Thus, the anchors can rotate around the pin relative to each other. So if you mount one on a wall and the other on a door, the door can swing open. And if you remove the pin, you can simply lift the door off the wall. Now here's the thing. Hinges have been discovered for use on massive, heavy gates dating back to 1600 BCE. And the Old Testament of the Bible actually describes the elaborate hinges used in King Solomon's temple. Babylonian, Assyrian, and Egyptian hinges have been discovered as well. But most of these hinges were massive. They were used for huge doors and gates of massive and elaborate structures. And they were extremely expensive and difficult to make. Most doors didn't use hinges at all. Instead, sockets were dug into the frame above and below the door at one side. Pins held the door in the sockets. This hinge post and socket construction was the way to make doors for centuries. In fact, it wasn't until the late medieval period and the early Renaissance that metalworking techniques became refined enough to produce affordable hinges for common use. And it was in the Victorian era that hinge manufacturing really exploded. But that was due to the number of new machines and inventions that required hinged parts. as a result of the beginning of the industrial era. And with that, we bring our first lost episode to a close. We hope you've enjoyed the brief look into how the Word of the Week comes to be and the exploration of topics that we just couldn't work into other episodes. We'd also like to thank each and every one of you for the support. The Word of the Week has become successful far beyond our expectations, and we'd like to see it continue to grow. So tell your nerdy friends about it. Play an episode for them. And rate us on iTunes or wherever else you get your episodes. Rating and reviewing helps new people find the show. Above all, though, just keep listening. We wouldn't be here without your support. This has been the GM Word of the Week. It was written by the Angry GM and recorded and produced by me, Fiddleback. You can find more at theangrygm.com and madadventurers.com.